It is my honor and pleasure to be speaking with you, Congressman McCaul. We've got a lot to discuss.
It's an honor to be here as well. Thank you.
All right, we have a lot to discuss. Congressman, one of CUFI's top objectives is ensuring the security of the State of Israel, and to that end, countering the threat of Iran. Now, the threat of Iran has been rearing its ugly head lately. Just today, Tehran announcing that it's going to further enrich uranium levels in violation of the JCPOA. Now, you're the top-ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And because of that, you have been privy to some of the consultations and deliberations with the president regarding his Iran strategy. I want to get your outlook on that. But first, I want to take a step backwards to about 3 weeks ago, when Tehran downed an unmanned U.S. drone over the Straits of Hormuz. You were part of the congressional committee that the president was consulting with on how best to respond and retaliate. We know that ultimately he called off a military strike due to concern over a high casualty toll. But put us in that room, if you will. Give us a sense of what it was like to be part of those deliberations.
You know, I've been in Congress for 16 years. I think it's one of the most intense conversations I've been engaged in. It almost, I was a history major. It took me back to almost like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we had to decide options on the table, what would be the appropriate response to not just tankers being shot in the Straits of Hormuz, but rather a United States military asset worth about $150 million. So it was very intense. One miscalculation here can lead to a larger war. There were various options on the table. I will tell you, and not to breach any confidentiality, but there were options to strike, particularly the surface-to-air missile vehicle that was used to bring down the United States drone. That was one option. The intelligence community would tell you that if we kill Iranians on Iranian soil, it's only going to galvanize support for the Ayatollah against the United States and Israel. I think the president decided to, not unlike maybe President Kennedy, took a little bit of a step back, took a little bit of a pause to not make a miscalculation and escalate the situation, but rather use a, well, I could say it's reported that cybersecurity operations were used to cripple command and control.
Can you confirm that cyber attacks were indeed launched?
Not if I want to not be prosecuted.
All right, fair enough, had to ask.
But having said that, I think, you know, I'm a little more hawkish. I think Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Bolton and I are very like-minded. I think a response is appropriate here, but at the same time, it may have worked out, I think, at the end for the best, because we're using tools we have that doesn't necessarily kill, but does cripple. The president, above all, wants to use diplomacy first, and so Secretary Pompeo is dispatched to the region to get the coalition partners together, and we're seeing that now. Theresa May, they intercepted a tanker bound for Syria, an Iranian tanker, right, that stopped them. President Macron in France has condemned their now violation of the JCPOA, which they have effectively done the last couple of days. They are now in violation. So the question is, does Europe want to continue to do business with Iran when they're in violation, you know, of the JCPOA? And I think not. So what the president's trying to do now is to, when he snapped back the sanctions, Mike Pompeo and I never agreed with the JCPOA when we were in the Congress, because it long-term would make sure a certain nuclearized Iran. It also had nothing to do, it didn't address ICBM capabilities, and it didn't address the terror threat. And what essentially happened was $150 billion, and sometimes in cold hard cash on airplanes, being sent to these terror operations. The IRGC, which has now been designated a terrorist organization, right, which I've stood for many years, but went into their operations to spread throughout the Shia crescent into Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And so I think this diplomatic push to his red line, the president, was clear. His red line is there will not be a nuclear Iran. And if there is, we have 100,000 tons of diplomacy called the USS Lincoln sitting there in the Persian Gulf.
Well, Congressman, to your point, the JCPOA did not, in fact, prevent from getting a nuclear weapon, only delayed it at best. And we know that the president's strategy is to get Tehran back to the negotiating table and come up with a deal that does prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, that does rein in its sponsorship of terrorist proxies around the globe, and that also confronts its intercontinental ballistic missile program. But where we're at right now, do you see Tehran coming to the negotiating table? What kind of timeline do you project? Because so far, the Ayatollah Khamenei has ruled out any kind of diplomacy with the U.S.
Well, and I think the idea of negotiating with the Ayatollah is obviously a challenge at best. But I do think that they are being crippled with the sanctions. I do think we're getting the world community rally behind us now. And I think if we're ever going to get a better deal with Iran, you know, now is the time to do it, along with the threat of military forces. Maximum pressure campaign that's being waged on Iran. What the secretary told me is they are accelerating the process. Under the JCPOA, they'd be guaranteed a nuclear bomb. And I've talked to Prime Minister Netanyahu extensively about this. They would be guaranteed. Now, that is off the table. And now they have a choice to make with the world community. Do they go forward with their nuclear program and ruin their country, or do they stop?
Well, Congressman, when you say the president says a nuclear weapon is the red line, we know that Iran is now starting to march again towards a nuclear weapon. Israel said it never actually stopped with that march, only pretended to under the premise of this deal. So when we say red line, at what point in its march towards a nuclear weapon does the U.S. or Israel, for that matter, consider some kind of preemptive strike?
Well, I think that's a determination the president's going to have to make. I think any issues of war and peace is probably the heaviest decisions to be made by the president. You could feel it in the room when we were discussing how to respond to the unmanned aerial vehicle being shot down. That, quite frankly, we were a little surprised because we thought it was high enough in the sky to be protected. But I think it's a discretionary call on the part of the president, but I think he probably made the right move for now, because now we can galvanize support with the coalition partners.
Are you seeing that? Because you do get a sense that perhaps the UK is taking a stronger action against Iran, as you mentioned, by seizing that oil tanker that was in violation of EU sanctions trying to get oil to Syria. Do you perhaps see the UK and the other Europeans, Germany and France, and perhaps the other signatories to the deal, fraying in terms of their consensus, and the UK acting like an ally and supporting the U.S.?
And I think that's the goal, is to dismantle the JCPOA, the Iran deal, once and for all.